Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ali Hamza. I was born Victor Mwabe, and the question about why I became a Muslim always arises whenever I meet somebody I've not seen in a long time. Unfortunately, this question opens a rabbit hole which would take me ages and take away all the conversation that I could be having with the person. So eventually the answer hijacks the conversation to the point that we end up not sharing much about what has happened in between. I've also been asked by friends, colleagues, to one day make a talk about why I became Muslim. So I'm making this talk now. One, so that I don't have to answer this question anymore. I can send somebody to my link. And secondly, for posterity, one day maybe my children will watch this video and look at me in a very different way. I was born in 1980, Kenyatta Hospital, Nairobi. My father was still a student. He was studying in England. And my mother was also a student, university here in Kenya. And I was brought up, I suckled my aunt, so she's my foster mother. And my early years were spent with my grandmother. When I was young, I had my first spiritual experience when I was about 4 years old. I remember because that was the time I first remember celebrating a birthday. And we were living in the west of Nairobi West. One night I was sleeping in my room as a kid, and something came in through my window. Basically, it looked like what I would later recognize in science class as a skeleton. But it had hair, despite being a skeleton, I remember. And if I could recall correctly, it had a short. So basically you can imagine a skeleton wearing a short and having hair. So it looked something like that. And it came to me in my bed. And I jumped out of my bed. Immediately it jumped out of the window. Now the window was a closed window made of glass, but it just held the frame of the glass and got out, like somebody jumping out of a building. And I ran downstairs, and we had a visitor. Forgive my cats. And I spent the rest of the night sleeping on the couch with, I think, my uncle. I remember he was an old man with white hair. Very white hair. Okay. Fluffy. And that was the first, but not the last, of my encounters with something which won't make sense to an ordinary person. My second encounter was when I was in India as an undergraduate foreign student. And in this encounter, this was the same month that I became Muslim. And it was an image of what the Catholics call a Virgin Mary, formed out of smoke right in front of me. Very white smoke. I've never seen such white. I don't know how I can explain it, but it was a white that I have never seen before. Very white. And it entered a room where my friends had been partying last night. There had been a football match. If I could recall, it was Barcelona versus Liverpool, Champions League final, if I remember correctly, around 2006, something there. And at that time, I was not a Muslim. So the white Virgin Mary was carrying a baby, what most of us recognize as baby Jesus and Mary. And I bow down before it. May Allah forgive me. It was out of ignorance, out of shock, really. I mean, I don't know what it's called, wonder. Awe, something. And it disappeared. But immediately it disappeared, everybody woke up and started running in the house in confusion. And I could see everybody running across in front of me, behind me. And then suddenly, everything reset. I was seated again on my chair. And everyone was sleeping on the carpet around me. We had partied too much. Now I was sober. I recall because a week before that I had been very sick. So I was on medication. And I was also trying to prepare my papers so that I could travel back to Kenya. You see, in India you need permission to leave, not just permission to go in. So you need an exit permit. And that will be based on your passport, and residency permit, which you should have got when you arrived. But they have a rule that you go to the police station within 30 days, and when somebody is still settling something, things like that sort of go over your head. And then when you miss the deadline, now there's a fine. And as a foreign student, you don't have that much flexible income to be paying fines all the time. So there was a reason I'd been delayed coming back to Kenya. So I had been staying there. I was with my friends. And that was my second spiritual awakening. perhaps my third, because my second one was actually when I cleared high school, and we had a gap year because we don't have a national youth service in our time. So that had created a gap year for people going to university once the youth service was abolished, the compulsory youth service. And that was not, I don't consider it part of my spiritual awakenings, because that was the year when I first experimented with marijuana. And one day on the roof of a building, I was just lying down in the evening around sunset, and the clouds formed the shape of a face of a man, a face which, if I'm not wrong, was the same face that we are shown as an image, a mountain on Mars. My religious journey was a bit more structured. My parents were first Seventh-day Adventists, so we used to pray on Saturday. But because of my dad's job, we ended up praying on Sunday, so we ended up shifting to the non-SDA churches, the Sunday churches. The first church, if I can recall, was Crisco, if I'm not wrong, because we used to go to Nairobi Cinema for service. Not really service, but prayer, Sunday prayer. Service, you can call it that, but not Mass. So Mass was more of a Catholic thing, and Protestants were more of having a service. So in around, after we shifted churches from Nairobi Cinema Sundays to Nairobi Pentecostal Church on Valley Road. It was still a new church. So in the Valley Road Church, I learned a lot about religion from the Sunday school. But despite all that, my mother had bought me books as a kid, comics, animated books, which are the stories of the prophets, the Old Testament. So in addition with the Bible, I was well grounded on the biblical narrative. Around 1988, I was in class 3, I think. We had something called pastoral in school, where every child had to go to a room where their religion was being taught. And the Catholic side was well made, well built. And I was, out of curiosity, I went to the Catholic side one day. And that was my first experience with shirk, because I saw statues and I considered them idols. I also saw the Eucharist, I think, the bread, which sacrament, and this was strange to me. But what really moved me was the statues. because the tradition I'd been reading as a kid of the Old Testament, all the time it was God against statues, God against idols, God against making images. So that was my only experience with the Catholic Church as a kid. Again, it happened in high school. Once I walked into the Catholic Church on a Sunday, and I gained the same revulsion. A lot of drum beating and singing and dancing and what was bothering me was the crosses and the statues. So even as a Protestant, the Valley Road Church had a big cross right in front, and I couldn't justify it from Scripture. Why is this thing in front of me when I'm praying? So those were questions in my head. When I went to high school, I became born again. I sang in the choir. I attended CU. It was my favorite function of the week. And I started reading the Bible more. I used to read it in primary school for the sake of language. Small head. Small head. Kuja. Come. I used to read it on Sunday because of, I started reading the Bible more, to the extent that I neglected my studies. But somehow at the end of 4 years, I went back to study and managed to pass the exam, make it to university. But during that period, other questions came into my head, because the people at the top, that's when I encountered being connected with the people at the top of a religious movement or body. And I could not reconcile their actions with Scripture. And they could not explain for me why Scripture is not turned into action. So I was a person who reads the Bible but couldn't practice most of it. I couldn't put my head on the ground when praying. I couldn't condemn crosses. I couldn't condemn statues. Couldn't condemn pictures. But this is what was in my heart based on my understanding of the Bible. So when I went to college in 1999, I remember my father was mad at me because I failed in religion as none. That was interesting because I did not backslide from Christianity. I did not have like bad company and then slowly committed sins and then fell off. No. In one day, I just said, this thing is not true. Not true in that the people don't practice their text, and the people argue against their text. Small things like, why do you eat pork? And somebody would tell you because some vision that Peter had from Jesus, and it said, you can eat anything that has been cleaned in my name. So something like that, which contradicted what to me was the fundamental message of Jesus, that I have not come to change the law. And so I went soul searching. In the first year of college, I studied the Old Testament. I was studying chemistry and mathematics, but my pastime was reading the Old Testament. I had a New Jerusalem Bible where God was referred to as Jehovah. So that was exciting. because it created for me that distinction between Jesus and God. When I went to, after college, unfortunately, I went to work in a factory and during college and during this period, I fell into alcoholism. And I'm not proud of what I did those days. But I had my own experience of life as an alcoholic, the kind of friends I made, kind of places I went, and the kind of things I saw in the world. That long story short, my father felt I needed to study more, so he sent me to India to study computer science. And when I got there, in the first year, the university had a recommendation, not a recommendation, but a requirement that every student must do a topic on Indian heritage and culture. So I looked at the syllabus of the different things, and I thought the shortest one and easiest one would be Buddhism. So I studied Buddhism for 1 year. The first thing it struck me about was that there were similar teachings between the New Testament and the teachings of Buddha. Yet Buddha came around 500 years before Christ. So two thoughts were in my head. Either the New Testament authors plagiarized things from Buddha, or there are universal truths that are taught in every religion. One new thing I remember I picked up from Buddhism was love for animals. It had not featured in my biblical background, Old Testament, New Testament. And it was only maximized with Islam. So that's why I have pets and I let them do what they want. Fluffy, kuja. Small head, kuja. Come. And in the second year, I started studying, I chose to study Hinduism. So, because I'd been excited what I learned in Buddhism, although I rejected Buddhism as a religion because of one fundamental factor. It did not have God. There's no God in Buddhism. At the end of the day, I was supposed to reach some enlightenment by myself, towards myself, and my inner self rejected that because I was not the most righteous of people. I'm good to people. I try to be good to people, but I harm my own soul a lot with my carefree lifestyle. So I knew inside me that I was not God. So a religion that was telling me to look inside me for God and negating, there were no prophets, no nothing. So I ended up with the conclusion that Buddha taught a lot and he searched a lot for enlightenment, but at the end, what he claimed was enlightenment, he just made it up under that tree, under the Buddha tree. You can't replicate it. And it opens the room for a lot of people who came after Buddha to make up what was this and what was not. So in my second year, I studied Hinduism. I read the Bhagavad Gita. I looked at the Upanishads. and a lot of Vedas. I was quite interested in the Rig Veda because it started like the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Brahma, and the Word was Brahma. So that was again either a text 30,000 years old, as the Hindus claim, or even 500 BC, as historians claim, had the same thing as the opening of John. So I was interested in writing my own book, a book that would only bring together what was the same in Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism. So I started my work in India, naive, excited. The internet was new. Actually, we were the first people to get email addresses in around 97, something this side of the world. Facebook was new at that time. I think it was brand new. And during my research to write my book, something hit me. I had taken all the religions, but there was one religion missing, and that religion is Islam. Now, when I was in India, I first went to live in a hotel alone. I'm a loner most of my life. I'm a loner. People think I am social, but that's only when I was drunk or dependent on alcohol. And when I arrived in India, I first landed in Mumbai. I remember because the stench really hit me, and the humidity. And I slept in a hotel, and I was conned to travel by bus to Hyderabad for $100. Only when I got into the bus, I realized the ticket was something like 200 rupees, something like $2. And I traveled overnight to Hyderabad from Mumbai. And the first thing that struck me in the morning as the sun rose at dawn, as we arrived in Hyderabad, because we arrived at dawn, was it was just a city of mosques, 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 mosques. So I thought, wow, I'm really lost. Already had had encounters with Islam before that. I remember a boy when I was around 8, 9, Kolomar, we used to share the school bus. And when I used to visit him, sometimes they were fasting. And my second high school, I remember Mahfoud, who was always wet after lunch because he was from praying. And my really big contact with Islam was September 11th. I was in college, and I remember when the plane hit the tower, the second plane, and I was watching. And I remember the feeling which was in my heart that time, that you have to be either crazy or have very strong faith to do such a thing. So, from a humanitarian perspective, it was a bad event to me, but from a faith perspective, I wanted to know what could make somebody have that kind of faith, to fly into a building. Okay, later we are told there were remote-controlled planes and everything. There's so many conspiracies. The thing is, I was not there, we didn't see, we don't know. But that was my attitude. So in India, when I arrived in Hyderabad. Hyderabad was a Muslim city. Mosques everywhere. And one of the first things that struck me were the Muslim women were looking very feminine because of their modesty. our women were more, let's just say, scantily clad and had less morals and were less inhibited. But now when I was studying now, writing my book, and one more thing, when I arrived, I stayed in a hotel, and my fellow Kenyan Students Association found out about me and tried to get me out of there to go stay in an area where other students live. But when I got there, I found that the Kenyan students were there were no different from Kenyans here. You see, now I'd been to university for 4 years before, so I was not really as young. I was 24. And I found that they were just trying to make a quick buck from new students. So I moved to the Tanzanian house, a house of Tanzanians, and they cooked a whole sufuria pot of pork. Now, I'd never eaten pork before. That was my first time and the last time. And there was a vibe about these Tanzanians against Kenyans that made me feel unwelcome in the house. So at night, because of my habits, I requested to know where I could find something to smoke. This led me to a house which I got in and I never got out. These were my friends now, my new friends. An old Kenyan student who'd been there for many years, and the rest were Muslims, Arabs, Sudanese, Saudi, Eritrea, UAE. So these were my friends who our lifestyles were compatible. We all liked partying, we all liked women, we all liked fun. While living with them, we used to have religious arguments. I will pause this video now and resume for the sake of nature.